being watched and surveilled by the fascist police. He can't get a job.
He was a printer by profession.
He was a printer by profession, and Silone was trying to get him out of Italy to Switzerland to settle down and get a job there. He's eventually arrested, he's tortured, he's tried, and he is sentenced to prison where he's beaten and eventually dies. So the first...
He was also of poor health, just like his brother.
He suffered from tuberculosis. In fact, he died of tuberculosis in prison. So the first hypothesis was that Silone started writing these letters to this police official, Guido Bellone in Rome, to help his brother who was arrested. But it also appears that some of these letters may have been written before Romolo was arrested. And I have a couple of them photocopied in the book. But it's obvious also that some of them were written by somebody else. As you can see from the two photocopies, they're in very different handwriting. So whether it was written by Silone, whether it was written
Silone
by...
at that point, Silone's name was Silvestri.
Well, he used Silvestri exactly as a kind of cover for some of these letters, yes.
Was this a common thing during that period that people changed their names in order to survive or to keep their freedom?
Changing names was very common.
Very common.
Writing letters to fascist or police officials was not so common. There's an extraordinary letter at the end in April of 1930 where Silone says, that's it, I'm going to stop this, I can't do this anymore, I want to end this relationship and I want to start my life anew. And I think Silone probably carried this burden of guilt and grief with him for the rest of his life. But he used it, I think, to transform himself into the writer that eventually he becomes.
I see. Before the fascist regime and during fascist regime, how was Silone seen from America? Because before we said that his novels were actually used as propaganda by the Allies, yes, in Europe, especially Italy and Germany probably. How was he seen from America?
In the United States, he becomes very popular as a writer, and in fact, Fontemara in the 1930s is transformed into a theatrical production and performed in Manhattan. Silone comes to be seen as this generation of what used to be called proletarian writers, writers of the left, who were writing either short stories or plays or novels about workers, about factory workers, about peasants, the downtrodden. So oftentimes he's mentioned in the 1930s in the same breath as, let's say, John Steinbeck, and becomes very popular. Bread and Wine, which came out a few years after Fontemara, was extraordinarily well received in the United States. And it proved to people, to critics, to readers, and to Silone himself, that Fontemara was not a fluke, that he really was a writer. In the United States, he was a very popular writer up until the 1960s and 1970s. In fact, I've met many people while I've been giving lectures who said, yes, I read Fontemara for the first time in an Italian, literature course in college, and I remembered it,
But the fact that his books were used as propaganda by the American government, it meant that also the officials, the U.S. officials, didn't think in a positive way of this writer.
They saw his writing.
Even though he was communist.
Even though he was what worked in his favor is that he had been expelled from the Communist Party. And during the Second World War, he actually comes to meet Allen Dulles, who was one of the leading figures of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the forerunner of the CIA. And Allen Dulles was in Switzerland looking to work with people like Silone to expedite the end of the Second World War, to defeat fascism, to defeat the Nazi occupation, and to get a sense of what would happen in Italy after the fall of fascism.
Now, while this was going on, he was also accused of receiving funds from the U.S. or other agencies.
Yes. Just as he had been accused of being a fascist spy, which comes much later after he dies in 1996, during his lifetime, he had been accused of being a spy for the CIA because of his work with Allen Dulles of the OSS. And later on in the 1960s, Silone, along with a colleague of his, Nicola Chiaramonte, is the editor. They are editors of a very important journal, a rivista called Tempo Presente.
In fact, he worked many years with this Tempo
He
Presente.
worked from 1956 until 1968, 12 years, very important years, because in 1956 you have the Soviet invasion of Hungary, in 1968 you have the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, and this journal, and there were similar journals in places like England and France and the United States.
And many international writers published big names.
The most prestigious names in European and American literature contributed to this journal. But in 1967, 1968, it comes out that the journal is being financed by the Ford Foundation, and the Ford Foundation was receiving its funds from the CIA. And when Silone was confronted with this fact, he closed down the journal and resigned.
Of course, we may believe that he did not receive any funds knowingly. He died as a poor man.
He died as a poor man.
With debt.
He died as a poor man. Oftentimes, I've seen, let's say, royalty statements from his various foreign publishers, like, cents, really. And he rented an apartment in Rome, kind of dismal, dark apartment in Rome his entire life.
It was never a rich, I think politically philosophical thinking. He really didn't even want to buy an apartment.
No.
So
in
he
fact,
really
yes,
stood by
exactly.
his principles.
After the war, when his wife Darina found an apartment and he looked at the fine print of the contract, it was sort of like a mortgage that after living there 20 years and paying rent, they would finally own it. And he was horrified by the fact that he would be like, owning real estate. So yes, I mean, money was never really a question with him. It was not important.
At least that aspect will do not create any shadows against his personality or against his.
And in fact, this came up with the spying scandal of the fascists, because it doesn't appear that money changed hands. So there was always a question of motive. I mean, why would he be writing these letters?
Yeah, I read in your book that there was a possibility maybe of homosexual experience.
Some
reason as a reason.
At least one or two scholars have put forth the thesis that Silone may have been blackmailed by Guido Bellone. That perhaps they had met beforehand. That once Silone became a leading member of the Communist Party, maybe this police official was trying to blackmail him, but there's no evidence of that.
No evidence, but apparently his wife complains that he goes with women a lot.
Yes, Silone, I interviewed Darina Silone, the widow, several times before she died, and she died in 2003. And we used to meet in her apartment in Rome, where they lived for many years. The same apartment in Rome. And she was quite frank that her husband, and other people have said this too, that he was not sort of like the stereotype of the Southern Italian, very extroverted, gregarious. He was very quiet, melancholy, oftentimes shy. He was not a good husband.
In the sense?
In the sense that he oftentimes criticized her. She, I think, had an idea that she was an intellectual and a writer at the same level as her husband. He, on the other hand, thought that she was good enough only to translate his books and maybe type his letters.
But she specialized in affairs of India.
She was born in Ireland. She had a very difficult relationship with the Catholic Church. Eventually she left. She found her spiritual fulfillment in India. She was a friend of Mahatma Gandhi, later on Indira Gandhi. And she traveled to India as often as possible, especially after Silone died in 1978.
Now, we said that somehow the U.S. government or the agencies